The old piano keys felt cold under Hannah Kim's fingers as she sat in the tiny apartment in Bizan. The piano was older than she was, with scratches on its wooden surface and keys that sometimes stuck when she pressed them too hard. But it was hers. And it was everything. Outside, the sounds of the busy street filled the air. Cars honked, people talked loudly, and children played in the narrow alley below their window. But when Hannah played piano, all those sounds disappeared. There was only music. Her grandmother Bakia sat in her favorite chair nearby, watching with tired but loving eyes. Bakia was 72 years old now, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and hands that showed years of hard work. She had raised Hannah since she was 7 years old, after the terrible car accident that took both of Hannah's parents away. "Play the Chopin piece again," Bakia said softly. "The one you've been working on so hard." Hannah smiled and placed her hands on the keys. The Chopin Ballade No. 1 was the most difficult piece she had ever tried to learn. It was full of fast parts that made her fingers dance across the keys and slow parts that made her heart feel heavy with emotion. She had been working on it for 3 years now, ever since she found the sheet music in her father's old piano books. Her father had been a musician too, though not a famous one. He played piano at local restaurants and small concerts around the city. He had taught Hannah her first songs when she was very young, showing her how to find the music inside herself and let it flow through her fingers. As Hannah played, she thought about him. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Music is not about playing the right notes, Hannah. Music is about telling a story that comes from your heart." The melody filled their small apartment, floating through the thin walls and out into the street. Sometimes neighbors would stop walking just to listen. Mrs. Lee from downstairs often said that. Hannah's piano made even the saddest days feel a little brighter. When Hannah finished playing, Bakia clapped her hands slowly. "Beautiful, as always," she said. "Your father would be so proud." Hannah turned around on the piano bench. "Grandmother, do you really think I'm good enough? Good enough to maybe play for more people someday?" Bakia stood up and walked over to her granddaughter. She placed her gentle hands on Hannah's shoulders. "Child, I have heard many pianists in my life. I have listened to recordings of the famous ones, the ones who play in big concert halls around the world. But none of them make me feel the way your music does." This made Hannah smile, but she still worried. She knew that other young pianists her age had better pianos, better teachers, and more money for lessons. She had learned most of her music from old books and by listening to recordings on their small radio. Her piano teacher, Mr. Kong, was kind but could only afford to give her lessons once a week because that was all Bakia could pay for. Bakia worked as a seamstress, fixing clothes for people in their neighborhood. She worked long hours every day, and Hannah often saw her counting coins late at night, trying to make sure they had enough money for food and rent. Sometimes Hannah felt guilty about the piano lessons, knowing how much they cost. "I could get a job?" Hannah said. "I'm 17 now. I could work after school and help pay for things." "No," Bakia said firmly. "Your job is to study and practice piano. That is what your parents would have wanted. That is what I want." 3 days later, something amazing happened. Hannah was practicing after school when she heard a knock at their door. Bakia answered it, and Hannah could hear excited voices in the hallway. A few minutes later, Bakia came back with a big envelope in her hands. "Hannah," she said, her voice shaking a little. "This is from the National Youth Music Competition. You remember the one you entered last month?" Hannah's heart started beating fast. She had almost forgotten about the competition. She had sent in a recording of herself playing the Chopin piece, but she never really thought anything would come of it. Hundreds of young musicians from all over Korea had probably entered. With trembling hands, Hannah opened the envelope. Inside was a letter with official letterhead. She read it once, then twice, then a third time before the words really made sense. "Grandmother," she whispered, I won first place." Bakia sat down heavily in her chair, putting her hand over her heart. "What does this mean?" Hannah kept reading. "It means I get to be on television." There's a show called Masters of Melody, and they want me to perform on it. It's live television, and millions of people will watch." The letter explained that Masters of Melody was Korea's most famous classical music television show. Every month, they featured young musicians who had won competitions or shown special talent. Famous musicians and conductors came on the show as judges, and many young performers had become famous after appearing on it. For the next hour, Hana and Bakaya sat together reading the letter over and over. They talked about what this could mean for Hana's future. Maybe music schools would notice her. Maybe she could get a scholarship to study music properly. Maybe she could have a real career as a pianist. That night, Hana could not sleep. She kept thinking about performing on television for so many people. She was excited but also scared. What if she made mistakes? What if the judges didn't like her playing? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the whole country? She got up and went to the piano in the dark. Very quietly, so she wouldn't wake her grandmother, she practiced the Chopin piece again. Each note had to be perfect. Each phrase had to tell part of the story she wanted to share. As she played, Hana thought about all the people who had helped her get this far. Her grandmother, who worked so hard to pay for lessons, Mr. Kong, who always encouraged her even when she made mistakes, her parents, who had given her the love of music before they died, but mostly she thought about the music itself. The way it made her feel complete, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When she played piano, she wasn't just a poor girl from a small apartment in Bizen. She was someone who could create beauty, someone who could touch people's hearts with sound. The next morning, Hana called Mr. Kong to tell him the news. He was so excited that he shouted with joy over the phone. "Hana, this is your chance," he said. "This is what we have been working toward all these years." They scheduled extra practice sessions to prepare for the television show. Hana would need to be ready to play in front of cameras with bright lights and a live audience. It would be different from playing in her quiet apartment, but she was determined to be ready. As she hung up the phone, Hana looked at her grandmother, who was smiling through tears of happiness. "We're really going to do this, aren't we?" Hana sighed. "Yes, child," Bakya replied. "We are going to show the whole world what beautiful music sounds like." 2 weeks after receiving the letter, Hana found herself sitting in a fancy office building in Seoul. She had never been to the capital city before, and everything seemed so big and important. The elevators were shiny, the floors were made of marble, and everyone walking around wore expensive clothes. Hana wore her best dress, the one Bakya had sewn for her last year for school concerts. It was simple but clean, and Bakya had stayed up late the night before making sure it looked perfect. Hana's grandmother sat beside her in the waiting room, holding her purse tightly and looking around with wide eyes. A young woman with a clipboard came over to them. "Hana Kim?" she asked with a bright smile. "I'm So Young, the assistant producer for Masters of Melody. Thank you so much for coming today." So Young led them through hallways filled with pictures of famous musicians who had been on the show. Hana recognized some of them from posters she had seen in music stores. Her heart beat faster as she realized she would soon be among these talented people. "We're so excited to have you on the show," So Young said as they walked. "Your competition recording was absolutely beautiful. The judges were very impressed." They stopped outside a door with a sign that read, "Producer Kim Min-ho." So Young knocked and then opened the door. Inside, a middle-aged man sat behind a large desk covered with papers and photographs. "Ah, our young star," Producer Kim said, standing up to greet them. He was a friendly man with a warm smile, and Hana felt a little less nervous. "Please sit down, we have a lot to discuss." Producer Kim explained how the show worked. Each episode featured 3 young musicians who would perform for a panel of judges and a live studio audience. The show was broadcast live on television every month, and it was very popular all across Korea. "The judges can be quite direct with their opinions," Producer Kim said carefully. "They take music very seriously and they expect the best from every performer, but don't worry too much about that. Just focus on playing your heart out." He showed them pictures of the 3 judges who would be on Hana's episode. The first was a famous violinist named Young Suk. The second was a well-known composer called Byung-ho. And the third was someone who made Hana's breath catch in her throat. "This is Maestro Dongwoo Park," producer Kim said, pointing to a photograph of a serious-looking man with gray hair and intense eyes. "He's probably the most famous conductor in Korea, maybe even in all of Asia. He's conducted orchestras in New York, London, Vienna, everywhere that matters." Hana had heard of Maestro Park before. Every music student in Korea knew his name. He was known for being brilliant, but also very demanding. Stories were told about how he would stop entire orchestra rehearsals if one musician played a single wrong note. Some people said he was too harsh, but others said his high standards made musicians better. "Maestro Park has a reputation for being honest," producer Kim continued. "He doesn't give false praise. If he likes your performance, you'll know it means something special. But if he doesn't single quotes ... quote, he paused. Well, he'll let you know that, too." So Young handed Hana a folder filled with information about the show. "You'll need to choose what piece you want to perform," she said. "It should be something that shows your skill, but also something that means something to you personally. You'll have exactly 8 minutes to perform." Hana already knew what she wanted to play. "I'd like to perform Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," she said without hesitation. Producer Kim raised his eyebrows. "That's a very challenging piece for someone your age. Are you sure you're ready for it?" "I've been working on it for 3 years," Hana replied. "It was one of my father's favorite pieces. He died before he could finish learning it himself." The room became quiet for a moment. Producer Kim and So Young exchanged glances. "That's very touching," producer Kim said gently. "And it will make for good television." Personal stories always connect with audiences. They spent the next hour going over practical details. The show would be filmed in 2 weeks. Hana would need to arrive at the studio early in the morning for rehearsals and sound checks. She would get to practice on the same grand piano she would use for the actual performance. "What kind of piano is it?" Hana asked. "A Steinway Grand," So Young answered. "One of the best pianos in the world." Hana tried to imagine playing on such an expensive instrument. She had only seen Steinway pianos in pictures and videos. The thought of touching those keys made her both excited and nervous. After the meeting, Hana and Bakaya walked around Seoul for a few hours before catching their train back to Bizen. They looked in shop windows and ate lunch at a small restaurant near the train station. It was the first time either of them had been to the capital city, and everything felt like an adventure. "Are you scared?" Bakaya asked as they sat on the train heading home. Hana thought about it for a moment. "Yes," she said honestly, "but I'm also excited. This is what I've always dreamed about, isn't it? Playing for people who really understand music." "Your father would be so proud," Bakaya said, taking Hana's hand. "He always said you had something special inside you." When they got home that evening, Hana sat at her old piano and played the Chopin piece. But somehow it felt different now. In 2 weeks, she would be playing these same notes on television for millions of people. One of those people would be Maestro Park, the man whose opinion could change her entire future. The next morning, Hana called Mr. Kang to tell him about the meeting. He was even more excited than before, if that was possible. "Maestro Park!" he exclaimed. "Hana, do you understand what this means? If he likes your performance, doors will open for you that you never imagined possible. What if he doesn't like it?" Hana asked quietly. Mr. Kang was silent for a moment. "Then you will learn from his criticism and become better," he said finally. "That's what real musicians do. They use every experience to grow." For the next 2 weeks, Hana practiced harder than she had ever practiced before. She played the Chopin piece over and over until she could perform it perfectly, even when she was tired or nervous. She practiced with her eyes closed, imagining the bright television lights and the faces of people watching her. Mr. Kang scheduled extra lessons and brought in a metronome to help Hana keep perfect timing. "On television, there are no second chances," he reminded her. "You have to be ready for anything." Bakia bought new batteries for their old radio so Hannah could listen to recordings of famous pianists playing the same piece. She wanted to hear how different musicians interpreted the music, what emotions they brought to each section. Some nights, Hannah lay in bed unable to sleep, thinking about Maestro Park. She had watched videos of him conducting orchestras, and she was amazed by how much passion he showed for music. When he conducted, his whole body moved with the rhythm, and his face showed every emotion the music contained, but she had also heard stories about his sharp tongue. Musicians who had worked with him said he never hesitated to point out mistakes, even small ones. Some said he had made grown men cry with his criticism. "I just want to make good music," Hannah whispered to herself one night. "I want to honor my father and make my grandmother proud." The day before she was supposed to leave for Seoul, Hannah received an unexpected phone call. It was So Young from the television show. "Hannah, I wanted to let you know that the show is getting a lot of attention," she said. "Word has gotten out that Maestro Park will be judging and people are very excited. We're expecting our biggest television audience ever." After hanging up the phone, Hannah sat quietly for a long time. Millions of people would be watching her play. Among them would be other young musicians, music teachers, and professional performers. The pressure felt enormous. But when she looked at her grandmother, who was preparing tea in their small kitchen, Hannah remembered why she was doing this. It wasn't for fame or money. It was for the love of music itself and for all the people who had believed in her dreams when she couldn't afford to believe in them herself. The television studio was much bigger than Hannah had imagined. When she and Bakia arrived at 6 in the morning, the place was already busy with camera operators, sound technicians, and people carrying clipboards who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Hannah wore a new dress that Bakia had worked on for 3 days straight. It was dark blue with simple lines, elegant but not too fancy. "You look beautiful," Bakia whispered as they followed So Young through the maze of equipment and cables. "The piano is over here," So Young said, leading them onto the stage. "You'll have about an hour to practice and get comfortable with it before the judges arrive." When Hannah saw the Steinway grand piano, she stopped walking. It was the most beautiful instrument she had ever seen. The black surface was so shiny she could see her reflection in it, and when she lifted the lid, the strings inside gleamed like silver. She sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The touch was completely different from her old piano at home. These keys responded to the slightest pressure, and the sound that came out was rich and clear in a way that made her heart skip. "It's perfect," she breathed. She played through the Chopin piece twice, getting used to how the piano felt under her fingers. The sound engineer adjusted microphones around the piano and asked her to play certain sections again so he could get the best possible sound. "This is going to sound amazing on television," he told her with a smile. By 10 o'clock, the studio audience began to arrive. Hannah watched from backstage as people filled the seats. There were music students, elderly couples, who looked like they had been attending concerts for decades, and families with children who seemed excited to be there. 5 minutes until the judges arrive, So Young announced. Hannah felt her stomach flip. She had been nervous all morning, but now the reality of what was about to happen hit her fully. In less than 2 hours, she would be sitting at that beautiful piano playing for all these people, plus millions more watching at home. "Remember to breathe," Bakia said, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. "And remember that your father is watching over you." The first judge to arrive was Young Suk, the violinist. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She greeted Hannah warmly and told her how much she was looking forward to the performance. The composer Byung-ho came next. He was younger than Hannah had expected, maybe in his 30s, with an easy laugh and a relaxed manner. "Don't be nervous," he told her. "We're all here because we love music. Just share that love with us." Then Maestro Dongwoo Park walked into the studio. He was exactly as imposing as Hannah had imagined. Tall and straight-backed, with silver hair perfectly combed and clothes that looked expensive. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when he looked at Hannah, she felt like he was seeing right through to her soul. "Miss Kim," he said, his voice deep and formal. I understand you'll be playing Chopin today. Yes, sir, Hannah managed to say. The Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Maestro Park nodded slowly. A challenging choice. I hope you're prepared for it. There was something in his tone that made Hannah's confidence waver. It wasn't mean exactly, but it was serious in a way that made her realize he wasn't going to. Accept anything less than excellence. At 11:30, the show began taping. The host, Jin-ho, was a cheerful man who introduced each segment with enthusiasm. He talked about the judges and the young performers, building excitement for what was to come. Hannah was the second performer of the day. She watched from the side of the stage as the first musician. A young violinist named Taemin played a piece by Batch. He was very good. And the judges gave him positive comments when he finished. That was lovely, Young Suk said. Your technique is solid, and you clearly understand the structure of the piece, Byung-ho agreed. I could hear that you've studied this music deeply. Well done, Maestro Park was more reserved. Competent, he said simply. You play the notes correctly. With more experience, you may learn to find more emotion in the music. Taemin looked a little disappointed by this lukewarm praise, but he thanked the judges politely and left the stage. And now, Jin-ho announced, please welcome our next performer, 17-year-old Hannah Kim from Busan, who will be playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Hannah walked onto the stage, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The audience applauded warmly, and she bowed before sitting at the piano. The stage lights were bright and hot, making everything beyond the first few rows of audience invisible. She adjusted the bench height and took a deep breath. In the front row, she could see Bakaya watching with tears already in her eyes. The sight of her grandmother gave Hannah strength. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening of the Chopin Ballade was soft and mysterious, like a question being asked in musical form. Hannah had practiced this beginning thousands of times, but sitting here in front of all these people, it felt completely new. The beautiful sound of the Steinway piano made every note seem more meaningful. As she moved into the first main section of the piece, Hannah began to relax. The music took over, just like it always did at home. She forgot about the cameras and the lights and the judges. There was only the piano and the story she was telling through the music. The Chopin Ballade was like a conversation between different emotions. Sometimes it was gentle and sad, like remembering someone you missed. Sometimes it was passionate and urgent, like trying to say something important before time ran out. And sometimes it was playful and light, like laughter on a spring day. Hannah could see in her peripheral vision that the judges were paying close attention. Young Suk was leaning forward slightly, completely focused on the music. Byung-ho had his eyes closed, letting the sound wash over him. And Maestro Park was watching. Hannah's hands with the intense concentration of someone who understood exactly how difficult this piece was. In the audience, people were completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to be moving more quietly than usual, as if they didn't want to disturb the spell that Hannah's music was casting over the studio. As she reached the middle section of the piece, where the music became more complex and demanding, Hannah felt a surge of confidence. Her fingers were finding every note exactly where they should be. The difficult passages that had given her trouble for months were flowing smoothly. She was playing better than she had ever played before. She thought about her father as she played the most emotional part of the piece. This was the section he had never been able to master, the part that had frustrated him for months before the accident. Now she was playing it for him, completing something he had started. The music built toward its dramatic climax, where all the different themes came together in a powerful statement. Hannah's whole body was involved now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, her arms and shoulders working together to create the big, full sound the music demanded. She could feel that something special was happening. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was communication, a direct line from her heart to everyone listening. She was telling them her story, her family's story, through the language of music. In the judges' section, Young Suk had tears in her eyes. Byung-ho was nodding slightly, clearly moved by what he was hearing. And even Maestro Park's stern expression had softened somewhat. Though he remained intensely focused on every detail of Hana's playing, the audience was completely captivated. Some people were leaning forward in their seats, others had their eyes closed, lost in the music. In the control room, the television director was making sure his cameras captured every moment of this remarkable performance. As Hana approached the final section of the piece, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for her grandmother who had sacrificed so much, for Mr. Kang who had taught her to love music properly, for her parents who had given her this gift, and for this moment, this chance to share what was in her heart with all these people. The last notes of the Chopin Ballade rang out in the studio, hanging in the air for a long moment before gradually fading to silence. Hana sat perfectly still, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing that she had just played the entire piece without any major mistakes. Then the applause began. The applause filled the studio like thunder. Hana looked up from the piano keys, her heart still racing from the intensity of the performance. She had poured everything she had into those 8 minutes, and it felt like the most honest thing she had ever done. She could see Bakia in the front row, clapping with tears streaming down her face. Other audience members were standing, their faces bright with appreciation. Even some of the camera operators were smiling and nodding as they continued to film. Hana stood up from the piano bench and bowed deeply to the audience, then turned to face the judges' table. Young Suk was still clapping enthusiastically, and Byung-ho had a warm smile on his face. Maestro Park was also clapping, though his expression was more reserved. But he was clapping, which had to be a good sign. Jin-ho, the host, walked onto the stage with his microphone. "That was absolutely beautiful, Hana," he said, his voice full of genuine emotion. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that was truly special." The audience murmured their agreement, and Hana felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her. She had done it. She had played her heart out on live television, and people had responded to her music. "Now let's hear what our distinguished judges have to say," Jin-ho continued. "Young Suk, would you like to begin?" The violinist smiled warmly at Hana. "That was remarkable," she said. "At your age, to play Chopin with such emotional maturity is really quite extraordinary. I could hear your personal connection to the music, and that's what makes a performance truly meaningful. Your technique is excellent, but more importantly, you made me feel something. That's the mark of a real musician." Hana felt her cheeks grow warm with happiness. To receive praise from such a respected musician was more than she had dared to hope for. Byung-ho spoke next. "I completely agree with Young Suk," he said. "What struck me most was your interpretation of the middle section. That's where many young pianists struggle because it requires not just technical skill, but real emotional understanding. You clearly have both. This was a very mature performance from someone who obviously has a bright future ahead of her." 2 positive reviews from 2 expert judges. Hana began to allow herself to believe that this was really happening, that her dreams might actually be coming true. She looked toward Maestro Park, waiting for his assessment. The famous conductor sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. For a long moment he said nothing, just studying Hana with those sharp, intelligent eyes. The studio became very quiet as everyone waited for his verdict. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke into his microphone. "Miss Kim," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio, "I'm afraid I must disagree with my fellow judges." Hana felt her stomach drop. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "While it's true that you managed to play most of the notes correctly," Maestro Park continued, his tone becoming colder, "what I heard was not the work of a serious musician. It was the work of an amateur who has learned to mimic the sounds of real artistry without understanding what they mean." The studio was now completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. Hana felt like the floor was falling away beneath her feet. "Your technique, frankly, is sloppy," Maestro Park went on, his voice growing sharper. "In the second movement, you rushed through the difficult passages instead of giving them the careful attention they deserve, and that mistake in measure 43. A properly trained pianist would never make such an elementary error." Hannah's mind reeled. She barely remembered making any mistake, but Maestro Park clearly had noticed something she hadn't even been aware of. Furthermore, he continued relentlessly, your interpretation lacks any real understanding of Chopin's intentions. You played with emotion, yes, but it was the wrong emotion. Chopin was a sophisticated composer who wrote for sophisticated audiences. What you gave us was, how shall I put this kindly, the musical equivalent of a child's drawing hung next. To a masterpiece, the audience was now completely still. Even the camera operator seemed frozen. Jin-ho looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting this harsh turn in the critique. Young Suk tried to interrupt. Maestro Park, I think perhaps, please, he said, holding up his hand. I'm not finished. He turned his attention back to Hana, who was standing frozen on the stage, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. Miss Kim, I understand that you come from humble circumstances, and I'm sure your family is very proud of your hobby, but this is a serious music program watched by serious music lovers. We have a responsibility to maintain certain standards. Each word hit Hannah like a physical blow. She could feel her face burning with shame and humiliation. The truth is, Maestro Park continued, you are simply not ready to perform at this level. Your playing reveals a fundamental lack of proper training, proper understanding, and quite frankly, proper respect for the music you're attempting to interpret. Chopin deserves better than this amateur-hour approach. The silence in the studio was deafening. Hannah could see Bacchia in the front row, her face pale with shock and anger. Other audience members looked uncomfortable, some shaking their heads in disapproval of the harsh critique. Perhaps, Maestro Park concluded, you should consider focusing on music as a pleasant pastime rather than pursuing it as a serious endeavor. There are many perfectly respectable careers that don't require the level of dedication and talent that professional music demands. I would hate to see you waste years of your life chasing an impossible dream when you could be doing something more suited to your abilities. The words hung in the air like poison. Hannah felt dizzy, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph, her chance to show the world what she could do. Instead, she was being torn apart on live television by one of the most respected musicians in the country. Jin-ho finally found his voice. Well, he said awkwardly, thank you, Maestro Park, for your dotsment. And thank you, Hannah, for your performance today. But Hannah barely heard him. She was trapped in a nightmare of humiliation and disappointment. All those years of practice, all those dreams, all of Bacchia's sacrifices to pay for lessons. Apparently it had all been for nothing, according to Maestro Park. She was just a deluded amateur who didn't belong on the same stage as real musicians. She managed to bow stiffly to the judges and began walking toward the side of the stage. Her legs felt weak, and she was fighting back tears. The audience gave her a sympathetic round of applause, but it sounded hollow to her ears now. As she reached the wings, she could hear Jin-ho trying to move the show along to the next segment, his voice artificially cheerful as he attempted to recover from the awkward moment, but the damage was done. In front of millions of viewers, she had been humiliated by one of the most important people in Korean classical music. Bacchia was waiting for her backstage, her eyes blazing with anger. That man has no right, she began. He's right, grandmother, Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not good enough. I never was. I've just been fooling myself all these years. That's not true, Bacchia said fiercely. You played beautifully. Everyone could see that, but Hannah wasn't listening anymore. She felt like she was drowning in shame and disappointment. All her life she had believed that if she worked hard enough, if she loved music enough, she could overcome any obstacle. But Maestro Park had just shown her that some gaps couldn't be bridged by passion alone. So-young appeared at her side, looking concerned. Hannah, I'm so sorry. Sometimes the judges can be difficult. Please don't take it too personally. But how could she not take it personally? This wasn't just criticism of her playing. This was a rejection of everything she had worked for, everything. She had dreamed of becoming as the show continued around them. Hannah sat in a corner of the backstage area, staring at the floor. She thought about going home to their small apartment, facing the neighbors who had been so excited about her television appearance. She thought about Mr. Kong, who had been so proud of her progress. She thought about all the hours she had spent at that old piano, believing she was building towards something meaningful. Most of all, she thought about her father and wondered if he would have been as disappointed in her as Maestro Park clearly was. The dream that had sustained her through years of poverty and struggle was lying in pieces around her feet, destroyed in less than 5 minutes by a man who didn't even know her name. The worst part was that maybe he was right. Maybe she really was just an amateur playing at being a musician, and everyone had been too kind to tell her the truth until now. The television studio felt different now. What had been a place of dreams and possibility just minutes before now felt cold and hostile. Hannah sat in the corner backstage, still wearing her blue dress that Bakya had sewn with such care, but now it felt like a costume for a play that had gone terribly wrong. Around her, the show continued. She could hear Jin-ho introducing the third performer, a young cellist named Min-jun. The audience was trying to return to their earlier enthusiasm, but there was still tension in the air from what had just happened. So-young knelt down beside Hannah's chair. "The show will be over in about 20 minutes, she said gently. "Would you like to wait in the green room instead? It might be more comfortable there." Hannah shook her head. She couldn't seem to find words anymore. Every time she tried to speak, she felt like she might start crying, and she was determined not to give Maestro Park the satisfaction of knowing how completely he had destroyed her. Bakya stood nearby, her hands clenched into fists. 70 years I've been alive," she muttered, "and I've never seen such cruelty. That man should be ashamed of himself." "Grandmother, please," Hannah whispered. "Don't make it worse." But Bakya was angrier than Hannah had ever seen her. Worse? How could it be worse? "That man just attacked my granddaughter on television for no reason." "You played beautifully, and everyone knows it." Young Suk, the violinist judge, appeared backstage during a commercial break. She looked upset and apologetic. "Hannah, I wanted to come and tell you personally that I thought your performance was wonderful. Please don't let one person's harsh words overshadow what you accomplished today." "But he's right, isn't he?" Hannah asked, looking up at the kind woman. "I'm not really good enough for this level. I'm just a girl from Bisan who learned to play piano in a tiny apartment." "That's exactly wrong," young Suk said firmly. "Some of the greatest musicians in history came from humble beginnings. What matters is not where you learn to play, but how much heart you put into your music. And you have more heart than many professionals I know." She sat down in the chair next to Hannah. "I've been judging young musicians for 15 years, and I can tell you that technical perfection without emotion is worthless. You have something special, something that can't be taught. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After young Suk left, Bakya sat down beside her granddaughter. "Do you remember what your father used to say about music?" Hannah nodded slowly. "He said music isn't about playing the right notes. It's about telling a story that comes from your heart." "And did you tell your story today?" "I tried to," Hannah said in a small voice. "Then you succeeded," Bakya said simply. "That man in there doesn't know your story. He doesn't know about the nights you practiced until your fingers hurt, or how you saved money for months to buy new sheet music, or how you play for Mrs. Lee when she's sad about her late husband. He doesn't know that your music has brought joy to people every single day for years." But even Bakya's words couldn't erase the sting of Maestro Park's public humiliation. Hannah kept hearing his voice saying she was an amateur, that she should give up her dreams and find something more suitable for her abilities. The worst part was knowing that millions of people had heard those words. Right now, all across Korea, people were probably discussing her performance. Some might defend her, but others would probably agree with Maestro Park. After all, he was the expert. She thought about going back to school on Monday. Everyone would have seen the show or heard about it. The other students who had been excited for her would now look at her with pity. Her teachers, who had been so supportive, would probably not know what to say. And Mr. Kong, how could she face her piano teacher after this? He had been so proud, so sure that this appearance would open doors for her. Instead, the most famous conductor in Korea had essentially told the entire country that she wasn't worth taking seriously as a musician. As the show neared its end, Hannah could hear the final applause from the studio. Soon the audience would be leaving, and she would have to walk past them to get to the exit. Some of them would probably look at her with sympathy, which somehow felt worse than if they just ignored her. Jinho appeared backstage as the credits rolled. He looked genuinely sorry about what had happened. "Hannah, I want you to know that in 5 years of hosting this show, I've never seen anything like that." Maestro Park was completely out of line, but he's the expert, Hannah said dully. "If he says I'm not good enough, then I'm not good enough." "That's not how it works," Jinho replied. "Music isn't about one person's opinion, even if that person is famous. Music is about connection, about moving people's hearts. And you did that today?" Whether Maestro Park wants to admit it or not. As they prepared to leave the studio, So Young handed Bakya an envelope. "This is Hannah's payment for appearing on the show," she said. "And please know that everyone here was impressed by her performance. What happened with the judge was ... unfortunate." The money felt meaningless to Hannah now. She had come here hoping to start a career, not to earn a few $100s. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, like payment for her humiliation. The ride home to Busan was the longest 3 hours of Hannah's life. She stared out the train window at the countryside, passing by, thinking about how different this journey was from the one they had taken to Seoul that morning. Then she had been full of hope and excitement. Now she felt empty and defeated. Bakya tried to fill the silence with encouraging words, but Hannah barely heard them. She kept replaying Maestro Park's critique in her mind, analyzing every harsh word. Maybe if she had practiced more, if she had been more careful, if she had chosen an easier piece... But deep down, she knew that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that she had been living in a fantasy. She had believed that talent and hard work were enough, that somehow she could compete with people who had been trained from childhood by the best teachers who had access to the finest instruments and the most prestigious schools. When they finally arrived home, it was almost midnight. Their small apartment looked exactly the same as when they had left that morning, but everything felt different. The old piano in the corner, which had once been her greatest treasure, now looked shabby and worn. The sheet music scattered on top of it seemed like evidence of her foolish dreams. Hannah walked over to the piano and closed the lid firmly. "What are you doing?" Bakya asked. "I think I'm done," Hannah said quietly. Maestro Park was right. I've been wasting time that I could have spent on something more practical. You can't be serious. I am serious, grandmother. I'm 17 years old. I need to start thinking about my real future, not some impossible dream. Maybe I can study business or accounting, something that will help me take care of you when you get older. Bakya's eyes filled with tears. Your parents didn't save money for your piano lessons so you could become an accountant. Your father didn't teach you to love music so you could give up at the first sign of criticism. This wasn't just criticism, Hannah replied. This was the truth. I'm not good enough, and I never will be. Some people are born for music, and some people aren't. I need to accept which kind of person I am. That night, Hannah lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Cars passing by, late-night conversations from the street below, the distant sound of music from a restaurant that stayed open late. All the normal sounds of life continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed for her. The dreams that had sustained her through years of struggle were gone, crushed in a few minutes by a man who didn't even know her name. Tomorrow she would have to start figuring out what kind of life she could build without music at its center. She thought about her father and wondered if he would understand her decision to quit. Maybe he would have told her that sometimes knowing when to give up was a kind of wisdom too. But she finally drifted off to sleep. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying something important, something that had been given to Her as a gift, and that she was now throwing away because one person had told her it wasn't valuable enough. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the faint sound of someone playing piano in another apartment, the melody floating through the thin walls like a ghost of everything she was about to leave behind. Hannah had made it almost to the edge of the stage when something inside her suddenly stopped moving. Her feet, which had been carrying her away from the piano and toward the exit, simply refused to take another step. Behind her, she could hear Jin-ho trying to salvage the show's momentum. Well, that was certainly an interesting variety of opinions from our judges. Now, let's move on to our final performer of the evening. But Hannah wasn't listening to him anymore. Instead, she was hearing something else entirely. It was her father's voice, as clear as if he were standing right beside her, saying the words he had repeated to her countless times when she was learning to play. Music isn't about being perfect, Hannah. Music is about being brave enough to share your heart, even when people might not understand it. She thought about all the times her father had struggled with difficult pieces, how he would practice the same passage over and over until his fingers were sore. He had never been a famous musician, had never played in concert halls or been reviewed by critics. But he had loved music with his whole being, and he had passed that love to her. She thought about Bakya, sitting in the audience right now, probably fighting back tears of anger and disappointment. Her grandmother had worked double shifts for months to pay for the new dress Hannah was wearing. She had sacrificed her own comfort for years to give Hannah piano lessons. Was this how that story was supposed to end? With Hannah walking away in defeat after one man's harsh words? Most of all, she thought about the music itself. The Chopin ballade that had lived in her heart for 3 years, that had helped her through lonely nights and difficult days. The piece her father had never been able to finish learning, but that she had mastered note by note, phrase by phrase, until it became part of her soul. Slowly, Hannah turned around. The studio was in transition. Camera operators were adjusting their equipment for the next performance, and the audience was settling back into their seats. Jin-ho was checking his notes, preparing to introduce Min-jun, the young cellist, but Hannah was no longer interested in following the show's schedule. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the backstage chatter. Jin-ho looked up, surprised. So did the judges at their table. Maestro Park, who had been reviewing papers in front of him, raised his head. With an expression of mild annoyance, "Yes, Miss Kim?" Jin-ho asked, clearly uncertain about what was happening. Hannah walked back toward the center of the stage, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, the studio audience, the judges, the camera operators, and through them, millions of people watching at home. "I would like to say something, if I may," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Jin-ho glanced at the judges, then at the show's producer, who was watching from the wings. This was definitely not part of the planned program. But the cameras were still rolling, and there was something in Hannah's demeanor that suggested this was going to be television worth watching. "Of course," Jin-ho said. "The stage is yours." Hannah walked to the center of the stage and looked directly at Maestro Park. The famous conductor was watching her with a mixture of curiosity and impatience, clearly wondering what this young amateur thought she had to add to his professional critique. "Maestro Park," Hannah began, her voice clear and respectful, but without the tremor of fear that had been there before. "I want to thank you for your honest assessment of my performance. You're right that I'm not a professionally trained musician. You're right that I learned to play on an old piano in a small apartment. And you're probably right that I made mistakes today that a more experienced pianist would not have made." The studio was completely quiet now. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, sensing that something significant was happening. "But with respect, sir," Hannah continued, "I would like to ask you something before I leave this stage. You spoke about what Chopin deserves, about the level of understanding and respect that his music demands. I would like to know if you believe that music belongs only to people who can afford the best training, or if it might also belong to people who love it enough to give everything they have to it." Maestro Park's eyebrows rose slightly. This was Not the response he had expected from a humiliated teenager. Furthermore, Hannah said, taking a step closer to the judge's table, I would like to propose something. You said that my interpretation lacked understanding of Chopin's intentions. You said that I played with the wrong emotions. I accept that criticism. But I wonder if you would be willing to demonstrate the correct way to approach a piece that requires both technical mastery and deep emotional understanding. She paused, gathering her courage for what she was about to say next. There is a piece that my father was working on before he died. It's a composition that very few pianists attempt, because of its extreme difficulty. My father spent months trying to learn it, but he never succeeded. He said it was like trying to capture lightning in a bottle, that it required not just perfect technique, but a kind of emotional honesty that most people aren't brave enough to show. The audience was leaning forward in their seats now. Even the other judges, Young Suk and Byung-ho, were watching with intense interest. The piece is Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2, the original version from 1913, Hannah said. I spent 2 years learning it after my father died as a way of finishing something he had started. It's a piece that demands everything from a pianist: technical perfection, emotional depth, physical endurance, and the kind of artistic maturity that you say I lack. Maestro Park was now paying very close attention. The Rachmaninoff Second Sonata was indeed one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. Known for its ferocious technical demands and complex emotional landscape, I would like to play this piece for you now, Hannah said, her voice steady and determined. Not because I think I can play it perfectly, but because I want to show you what it means to pour your whole heart into music, even when you know you might fail. My father never got to finish learning this piece, but maybe today I can finish it for him. She turned to address Jin-ho and the show's producer. I know this isn't part of the planned program, and I understand if you need to say no. But I would like the chance to show that music isn't just about technical training or professional credentials. Sometimes music is about having the courage to reach for something beautiful, even when people tell you it's beyond your grasp. The studio was electric with tension. Jin-ho looked at the producer, who was frantically calculating the television impact of what was happening. This was completely unscripted, completely unprecedented, and absolutely riveting, but it was Maestro Park who answered first. Miss Kim, he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. The Rachmaninoff Second Sonata is not a piece for amateur pianists. It's a work that has challenged some of the greatest artists of the past century. Are you certain you want to attempt it in front of this audience? I'm certain, Hannah replied, without hesitation. I've been playing it for 2 years, and it's the most important piece of music in my life. If I'm going to leave this stage, I want to leave it playing something that represents who I really am as a musician. Maestro Park studied her for a long moment. There was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there during her first performance. A kind of fearless determination that reminded him of something he had lost somewhere along his own path to success. Very well, he said finally. I would be interested to hear your interpretation of Rachmaninoff, though I should warn you that this piece has humbled far more experienced pianists than yourself. I understand, Hannah said. But my father taught me that the most important thing about music isn't whether you succeed or fail, it's whether you're brave enough to try. She walked back to the piano, and as she sat down on the bench, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This wasn't about proving anything to Maestro Park or the judges or the audience anymore. This was about honoring her father's memory and playing music that came from the deepest part of her soul. She placed her hands on the keys and looked out at the audience one more time. In the front row, Bakia was watching with tears in her eyes, her face shining with pride and love. This is for you, Father, Hannah whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear, and then she began to play the most difficult music of her life. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2 erupted from the Steinway like controlled thunder. This was not the gentle, lyrical opening of the Chopin Ballade. This was music that demanded everything from the very first moment: technical precision, physical power, and emotional fearlessness. Hannah's hands moved across the keyboard with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious mind. The opening theme was dark and turbulent, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Every note had to be perfect, every phrase had to build on the last, creating a musical architecture that was both complex and deeply moving. In the audience, people who had been settling back into their seats were now sitting up straight, their eyes wide with amazement. This was completely different from the sweet, accessible Chopin they had heard earlier. This was music that grabbed you by the shoulders and demanded your complete attention. Maestro. Park leaned forward in his chair, his expression changing from skeptical interest to genuine surprise. He knew this piece intimately. He had conducted orchestras and performances of Rachmaninoff's piano concertos many times, and he understood exactly how difficult what Hannah was attempting really was. The fact that she had even memorized the entire sonata was remarkable for someone her age, but it wasn't just that she knew the notes. As the first movement unfolded, it became clear that Hannah understood the emotional landscape of the piece in a way that went far beyond her years. The music seemed to pour out of her like a confession. Raw and honest and completely unguarded, young Suk had tears in her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of sympathy. They were tears of recognition, the kind that come when you witness something truly extraordinary. "My God," she whispered to Byung-ho, "listen to her play." The composer nodded, completely absorbed in what he was hearing. "This is what we were talking about," he said quietly. "This is emotion made audible." As Hannah moved into the more technically challenging passages, her whole body became involved in the music. Her shoulders and arms worked together to create the big orchestral sounds that Rachmaninoff demanded. Her fingers flew across the keys and passages that would challenge professional concert pianists. But she made it look almost effortless, but it was more than just technical skill. There was something in her playing that spoke to the very heart of what music could be. She wasn't just reproducing the notes that Rachmaninoff had written down. She was channeling something deeper, the composer's own struggle with depression and exile, his longing for a homeland he could never return to, his desperate need to create beauty in a world that often seemed hostile to beauty. In the control room, the television director was frantically signaling his camera operators. This was the kind of moment that made careers, the kind of performance that people would remember for years. He made sure that every angle was covered, every emotion captured. The second movement began with a haunting melody that seemed to float above the darker accompaniment, like a memory of something beautiful that had been lost. Hannah played it with such tenderness that it felt like she was cradling something fragile and precious in her hands. This was the section that her father had struggled with most. She remembered finding him at the piano late one night, playing the same passage over and over, trying to find the right way to express the heartbreak that lived in those notes. "It's like trying to sing a lullaby while your heart is breaking," he had said. Now, as Hannah played those same notes, she felt her father's presence with her. Not just his memory, but his actual presence, as if he were sitting beside her on the piano bench, guiding her hands and whispering encouragement in her ear. The audience was completely silent except for the music. Even the camera operators seemed to be moving more carefully, as if they were afraid to disturb something sacred. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was a communion between a young woman and her deepest feelings, played out through one of the most challenging pieces of music ever written. Maestro Park found himself thinking about his own journey as a musician. He remembered being Hannah's age, full of passion and dreams, before years of professional criticism and commercial pressures had taught him to be careful, to be safe, to never risk failure in public. When was the last time he had heard music played with this kind of fearless honesty? As the second movement reached its climax, Hannah's playing became even more intense. The music seemed to be pulling emotions from places inside her that she didn't even know existed. She thought about her parents, who had died too young. She thought about Bakya, who had given up her own dreams to raise her granddaughter. She thought about all the nights she had practiced alone, believing that somehow her music mattered, and she thought about Maestro Park's words, about being told that her dreams were impossible, that she should find something more suitable for her abilities. All of that pain and frustration flowed into the music, transforming it into something that was uniquely hers. The final movement was a tour de force that demanded everything from both the pianist and the piano. Rachmaninoff had written passages that seemed almost impossible to play, cascades of notes that had to be perfectly articulated even at blazing speed, harmonies that stretched the hands to their physical limits, rhythms that challenged even the most experienced musicians, but Hannah met every challenge head-on. Her technique, which Maestro Park had criticized as sloppy, was now revealed to be far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. She had simply been holding back during the Chopin, playing safely. Now, with nothing left to lose, she was showing everything she was capable of. The music built toward its final climax like a wave gathering force before it crashes against the shore. Every theme from earlier in the sonata returned, woven together, in a tapestry of sound that was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Hannah's hands moved across the keyboard with such speed and precision that they seemed to blur, and then, in the final measures, something magical happened. As the last thunderous chords rang out, there was a moment of perfect silence, as if the entire universe had stopped to listen. The music seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the walls of the studio and settling into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what had just happened. Hannah sat motionless at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing that she had just played through the entire sonata without a major mistake. More than that, she had played it better than she had ever played it before, as if the emotional intensity of the moment had unlocked something inside her that she hadn't known was there. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, from somewhere in the back of the studio, someone began to clap. Slowly, quietly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Others joined in, and within moments the entire studio was erupting in applause, but this wasn't the polite, appreciative applause that had followed her Chopin performance. This was something different entirely, a thunderous, emotional outpouring that seemed to come from the very depths of the audience's souls. People were standing, some were crying, others were shaking their heads in amazement. Bakia was on her feet, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her hands hurt. Young-suk and Byung-ho were both standing as well, their faces shining with emotion and admiration. And Maestro Park. Maestro Park was standing too, his stern expression completely transformed. There were tears on his cheeks, tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. His hands moved slowly as he clapped, as if he were in a trance. For a moment, Hannah just sat there, overwhelmed by the response. Then she stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. The applause grew even louder, if that was possible. She bowed deeply, first to the audience, then to the judges. When she looked at Maestro Park, she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see there: respect, admiration, and perhaps even a little bit of awe. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but finally began to fade as people realized that something more was about to happen. Maestro Park had risen from his chair and was walking slowly toward the piano, his expression unlike anyone in the studio had ever seen from him before. Jin-ho stood frozen with his microphone, completely unsure of what to do. This was so far outside the normal structure of the show that there was no script to follow, no planned responses to guide him. All he could do was watch and let whatever was going to happen unfold naturally. When Maestro Park reached the piano, he stopped and looked at Hannah for a long moment. The studio was so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the cameras and the soft breathing of hundreds of people holding their breath. "Miss Kim," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio, "I owe you an apology." Murmur ran through the audience. In 15 years of judging young musicians on television, Maestro Park had never apologized to anyone. His reputation was built on his uncompromising standards and his refusal to soften his critiques for the sake of anyone's feelings. "When you played the Chopin earlier tonight," he continued, "I heard technical imperfections, and I allowed those small flaws to blind me to something much more important. I failed to hear what you were really saying through your music. Hannah stood perfectly still, hardly believing what she was hearing. But just now, Maestro Park went on, when you played the Rachmaninoff, I heard something that I have not heard in a very long time. I heard a musician who understands that music is not about perfection. Music is about truth. And you, Miss Kim, have just shown me what musical truth sounds like. He turned to address the camera directly, knowing that millions of people were watching. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spent my entire career working with some of the most technically accomplished musicians in the world. I have conducted orchestras in the greatest concert halls on every continent. But I must tell you honestly that what I just witnessed represents the kind of artistry that cannot be taught in any conservatory. The audience was completely absorbed in what he was saying. Even the camera operators seemed to have forgotten. They were working, watching the scene unfold with the same fascination as everyone else. This young woman has just demonstrated something that I myself have been struggling to achieve for over 20 years. Maestro Park continued, his voice growing stronger. The Rachmaninoff Second Sonata is a piece that I have attempted to master many times. I have studied it with the finest teachers, analyzed it with the most sophisticated musical minds, practiced it until my fingers bled. He paused, and for a moment his composed facade cracked slightly, revealing something vulnerable underneath. But I have never been able to finish it, he admitted. Every time I reach the final movement, I find myself overwhelmed by its emotional demands. The music requires a kind of fearless honesty that I have forgotten how to access. Hannah's eyes widened in amazement. She could hardly believe that this distinguished man, this musical giant, was confessing his own limitations in front of all these people. Tonight, Maestro Park said, looking back at Hannah, you have reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Not because it allows us to show off our technical skills, but because it allows us to share our deepest feelings with other human beings. You played that sonata not just with your fingers, but with your entire soul. Young Suk was crying openly now, and even Byung-ho was wiping his eyes. In the audience, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. This was not just about music anymore. This was about the courage to be vulnerable, the willingness to risk everything for the sake of artistic truth. I said earlier that you should consider giving up your musical dreams, Maestro Park continued. I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire career. What you possess cannot be taught, cannot be bought, and certainly cannot be dismissed because of your background or your training. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. Miss Kim, I would like to offer you a full scholarship to study at the Seoul National Conservatory, where I serve on the faculty. Furthermore, I would like to personally oversee your musical education if you would accept me as your teacher. The studio erupted in gasps and applause. A scholarship to Seoul National Conservatory was the dream of every serious young musician in Korea. To have it offered by Maestro Park himself, in front of a national television audience, was beyond anything anyone could have imagined, but Hannah was too overwhelmed to respond immediately. Just an hour ago, she had been walking off this stage in defeat, convinced that her musical dreams were over. Now the same man who had crushed her spirit was offering her everything she had ever hoped for. She began, then stopped, unable to find words. Bakya appeared at the edge of the stage, having somehow made her way past the security guards and production assistants. She was crying and laughing at the same time, her face radiant with joy and pride. "Grandmother," Hannah whispered, and suddenly she was running toward her, crossing the stage in a few quick steps and throwing her arms around the woman who had sacrificed everything for her dreams. The audience rose to their feet again, applauding. Not just the musical performance, but the obvious love between the grandmother and granddaughter. The cameras captured every moment of the embrace, and across Korea, millions of viewers found themselves crying along with the two women on the stage. "I'm so proud of you," Bakya whispered in Hannah's ear. "Your parents would be so proud." After a few moments, Hannah turned back to face Maestro Park, still holding her grandmother's hand. "Master Park," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "I would be honored to study with you, but I have one condition. The maestro raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I want to continue living with my grandmother, Hannah said. She has been my teacher in life, and I don't want to be separated from her. Maestro Park smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all evening. Of course, he said. Great artists need strong roots. Your grandmother is clearly one of your greatest strengths. Jinho finally found his voice and approached with his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his own voice thick with emotion, I think we have just witnessed something truly extraordinary. Hannah Kim, congratulations on your scholarship, and thank you for reminding all of us why music matters. As the show finally came to an end, the studio remained buzzing with excitement. Audience members lingered, reluctant to leave after witnessing such an unprecedented moment. Camera operators and production assistants who had worked on hundreds of shows were saying they had never seen anything like it. So Young appeared beside Hannah with a huge smile on her face. That was the most incredible television we've ever produced, she said. I wouldn't be surprised if this episode wins awards. But Hannah wasn't thinking about television anymore. She was thinking about the future that had just opened up before her, the chance to study with one of the world's great musicians, to develop her talents in ways she had never imagined possible. More than that, she was thinking about her father and how proud he would have been to see her finish the piece that had challenged him so much. She had kept her promise to complete what he had started, and in doing so she had found her own voice as a musician. 6 months later, Hannah sat in a practice room at Seoul National Conservatory, working on a new piece under Maestro Park's guidance. The conservatory was everything she had dreamed it would be, filled with serious musicians from around the world, equipped with the finest instruments, and offering opportunities she had never imagined. But the most remarkable change wasn't in her surroundings. It was in Maestro Park himself. Working closely with Hannah had reminded him of the joy and passion that had originally drawn him to music. His teaching style had become more encouraging, more focused on helping students find their unique voices, rather than simply correcting their technical mistakes. Remember, he said to her during one of their lessons, technique serves emotion, not the other way around. You taught me that. Hannah had kept her promise to stay close to Bakia. Every weekend, she took the train back to Bizen to spend time with her grandmother. They would sit together in their small apartment, and Hannah would play on the old piano that had started her journey. It didn't sound as rich as the Steinway Grand at the conservatory, but it was still home. The television episode had aired 2 weeks after the taping, and it became one of the most watched programs in Korean television history. People talked about it for months, and clips of Hannah's Rachmaninoff performance spread across the internet, inspiring young musicians around the world. But for Hannah, the most important result was simpler than fame or recognition. She had learned that music was not about proving herself to critics or living up to other people's expectations. Music was about having the courage to share her authentic self with the world, regardless of whether that self was polished enough for some people's tastes. Mr. Kang, her first piano teacher, had cried when he watched the show. I always knew you were special, he told her when she visited him. But I never imagined you would find such a dramatic way to prove it. Young Suk and Byung-ho had both reached out to offer their support and encouragement.